Okay, good morning, everyone. You are very welcome to today's webinar, where we are going to be going through resident engagement strategies, the requirements of Section 91 and the importance of your strategies and how one size definitely doesn't fit all. If you can go on to the next slide, please. So today's webinar will be delivered by David Hills. David Hills is Senior Director for Regulatory, Technical Solutions within Ark Workplace Risk. David is a chartered building surveyor, a fire engineer, and also a health and safety consultant with experience in structural engineering and assessments. David has been with Ark for over 23 years, and he is incredibly well known and respected in the industry and manages over 1,000 clients' risk management and queries on a regular basis. So what we will be going through on today's webinar is we will go through a background. So we are going to discuss here some elements of the Grenfell Tower disaster, what has changed, and more importantly, what hasn't changed. We'll also go through the Hackett report. We'll then deep dive into the new regime and in particular the requirements of Section 91 of the Building Safety Act and some aspects in regards to Section 62. We will go through what the regulators' expectations are here and the requirements of the new regime. And as I touched on, how one size all is not the approach that we can take. And we're going to discuss some emerging trends that we're seeing here in the industry. What is a resident engagement strategy? What does it involve? What does successful look like? And what are the requirements? And we're going to go into detail on understanding residents' demographics, their needs, their preferences, and why this is critical to our resident engagement strategies and why it needs that level of detail and why bespoke needs to be considered. We'll look at success, what success looks like, what a successful resident engagement strategy is, what it's needed, and the level of engagement that we need when we're looking at our resident engagement strategies. We'll go through conclusions and what we've discussed. And as always, at the end of today's webinar, we will allow time for Q&A. So if you can utilise the chat function as we go through, we will endeavour to get through as many questions as we can. So I will now pass you over to David Hills to commence today's webinar.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you are all well. Okay, so I want to go straight into some of the background. I'm going to go straight back to Grenfell. Because what was really interesting is prior to the night of the Grenfell fire, a number of residents raised multiple concerns and complaints about fire safety. Now, on that night, obviously 72 people died. They were elderly, middle-aged, even a newborn and a stillborn. They died in a tragic accident, which actually, if you think about it and you read through the Grenfell Tower inquiry report, was entirely, completely avoidable. But what was interesting is that residents' worries were effectively dismissed and considered to be uneducated. They were instead labelled as troublemakers, constant complainers who effectively should be ignored. One resident actually raised concerns about the risk of fire about a year before the actual fire itself. He asked for a proper and detailed evacuation plan, and he wanted to make sure that residents knew what to do in the event of a fire. But again, he was completely ignored. He was treated with hostility and contempt. We also got evidence that a number of other residents were asking for information or complaining about the problems with faulty fire doors, and that changes to the actual floor numbers during the refurbishment were actually causing confusion. Now, according to Sir Martin Morbick, all of these issues were proven effectively to have increased the loss of life that night. He effectively said that if residents had been listened to and importantly actioned, then many of those may still be alive. So that was obviously 2017. Things have changed, or have they? It is still happening. And when we go back and we have a look at what's happened since then, in 2020, we had the death of toddler Awab Ishak. in December 2020. That's led now to more legislation known as AWAB's law. Now that's due to come into force in 2025. AWAB's father actually had repeatedly complained about the condition of their home. He went back to his local housing authority, who actually blamed their lifestyle on the problems they were having, suggesting that they were boiling food. In fact, the inquest to the toddler's death found that the ventilation system within the flat was completely inadequate. So we are going to get an introduction of a new law, AWAB's law. Now, originally that law was going to go for and consider social housing only, but importantly, the new government have suggested that actually they're going to extend that to parts of the private rented sector as well. In February 2024, Birmingham City's housing department were found guilty of actually 6 really severe maladministration issues, all based around how they were handling residents' complaints, ignoring residents' complaints in some instances, and basically a failure to serve and deliver a safe housing, which effectively had led to a complete collapse in trust of the residents. Well, that's not me saying that. That again is the Ombudsman as well. And in fact, the Ombudsman just a couple of weeks ago revealed that they have actually seen a surge of 474% surge in complaints about repairs and conditions. And they are extremely concerned that people are still not being listened to. So what actually happened immediately after the event? Well, Dame Judith Hackett produced her report, and it's Dame Judith Hackett's report that has actually led to the significant changes in the regime, the introduction of the Building Safety Act, the introduction of the 30-odd pieces of secondary legislation as well. But in 2018, Dame Judith suggested that the actual current system that we have was just completely not fit for purpose. She came up with some pretty stark and pretty worrying and concerning statements that she suggested that as an industry, we were ignorant. We were ignorant of the regulations and the guidance. Those guidance and regulations were either misunderstood or just not read by those who needed to actually read them. What was also worrying is that she suggested that the industry was actually indifferent, that with a primary motivation was not to do things the right way, but to do things quickly and cheaply. She effectively suggested that where concerns were raised, they were often ignored, especially by residents and by property managers. And she also suggested that as an industry, we thrived on a lack of clarity, and suggesting that those who were responsible for building safety were actually using what is a pretty, or was a pretty poor set of regulations and guidance to game the system. And she made a certain recommendation that the duty holder of a high-rise residential block should have a resident engagement strategy. And her recommendation made its way straight through into legislation. And that's effectively where the new regime stems from. So what does the new regime require? As Tara was talking about earlier, I want to take you through very quickly Section 71 of the Building Safety Act. Now, Section 71 sets out the key framework elements. Other pieces of legislation, the secondary legislation, sets out the key requirements, which I'll go through later on as well. But effectively, as a principal accountable person, any principal accountable person for an occupied high-risk building, so that's a building currently over 18 meters in height or 7 or more stories, containing 2 or more flats, 2 or more rooms used for residential purposes or for student accommodation. Then the first thing they have to do is, as soon as reasonably practical after the relevant time, and the relevant time is immediately after occupation. So if you've got an occupied building, then you've got to make immediate changes and develop that strategy now. Then you must prepare a strategy known as a residents engagement strategy. And the objective, the whole purpose, is to promote the participation of relevant persons. I'll go through the definition of relevant persons in a few moments in the making of building safety decisions. A lot of people are particularly concerned about this and say, well, hold on a moment, how do we get them involved in building safety decisions? I'm going to hopefully take you through some practical approaches and how you can actually support that whole methodology. In addition to that, the section 91 says that you must review the strategy at prescribed times. I'll go through that later, and revise it if they consider it necessary or appropriate to do so. And effectively, the secondary legislation has set out when that review process needs to kick in. And again, I'll go through that in a few moments. The third element within section 91 is that in prescribed circumstances, that the relevant persons must be consulted, and prescribed persons, which includes the regulator and the fire authority, on your strategy, and that you must take those representations into account when next reviewing the strategy. And finally, and perhaps most importantly in respect of a resident engagement strategy, principal accountable persons must act in accordance with the strategy. So if your strategy says you're going to do X, then you must do X. You can't just turn around and say we're going to have quarterly meetings and then not bother to hold them. You've got to ensure that when you state within your policy that you're going to do something, that you actually follow that strategy and act in accordance with it. I promised I would talk about relevant persons and give you a definition of relevant persons. Well, the definition within the regulations, within the Act, states very clearly that relevant persons are effectively two groups of people. They are the residents of a high-risk building who are over the age of 16 and owners of residential units within the building. So it's extremely difficult, we know, in order to determine who is within your building. But effectively, the relevant persons within your building are residents over the age of 16 or owners of residential units within the building who may either sublet property or use it for a different purpose. Okay. So that's section 91. That's the legal requirements for what we need to do. And you'll notice I mentioned earlier, it's all about making decisions relating to what's called the building safety risks. So again, I just really want to focus on building safety risks because it's really important that we understand what the definition of a building safety risk is and what is not a building safety risk. So a building safety risk actually is defined within section 62 as a risk to the safety of people in or about a building arising from any of the following occurring as regards to the building. And they've effectively placed two current requirements. That's the spread of fire and structural failure. Now, we do have the option for the Secretary of State to add any other prescribed matter, and it is likely over the coming years that the scope is going to be included within the definition of what a building safety risk is. But currently, it is looking at the risks relating to the spread of fire and structural failure. Therefore, when we come to resident engagement, issues and risks such as antisocial behaviour, utility problems, cleanliness, all fall outside of the scope of building safety. But actually, if you think about it, a resident engagement strategy, whilst it's designed to promote activity by residents in building safety decisions, can actually be used to support dealing with antisocial behaviour and those other issues. So there isn't a reason why you shouldn't use it for other purposes. The legal requirement is that we have to ensure that we are promoting access and engagement with relevant persons on spread of fire and structural failure. But there are benefits for expanding that. I also wanted to touch on the review side and just to give you the legal side of reviews. And basically, a resident engagement strategy must be reviewed every 2 years as a minimum. So we can't just write a resident engagement strategy and think, well, I've done that, I don't have to do it again. Every 2 years, that resident engagement strategy must be reviewed, must be updated, or it must be updated within a reasonable period following the conclusion of a consultation. And there is a time when we need to go through consultation, and I'll go through that in a few seconds. Or that it's within a reasonable period of time following a mandatory occurrence report being submitted. Generally, a report will be submitted to the regulator. The regulator will therefore expect you to be reviewing your resident engagement strategy and republishing that, if appropriate, to the residents. And then in addition to that, it must be reviewed within a reasonable period of time after the completion of any significant material alterations to the building. And the definition of significant material alterations basically means that if you're changing the layout or changing anything to do with fire safety or structural side of the building, then again, you have to ensure that you review your resident engagement strategy and consult effectively with the relevant persons and the prescribed persons as well. Okay, so what do we talk when we talk about consultations? What are we talking about here? Well, consultations are required firstly to be undertaken when you first have your resident engagement strategy published. That's the first opportunity to actually consult with residents. And then effectively you can take that consultation, and then next time you review your consultation, your resident engagement strategy, you should take their views into account. You should also ensure that any change that is required is actually made to the resident engagement strategy within a reasonable period of time, and that any consultation that you have must last for at least 3 weeks in length. So we've got to give everybody 3 weeks time in order to respond to any consultation process. So the consultation process is in place, the resident engagement review process is in place. We know who the relevant persons are. Why are resident engagement strategies so important, and why are we talking about them now? Well, what we are finding and what we are hearing from the regulator is that they are not particularly happy at the moment with the level of detail being issued within certain resident engagement strategies. Now, resident engagement strategies form an essential part of the building assessment certification process. Effectively, when you submit your application for the building assessment certificate, when you're directed to do so by the regulator, they are expecting you to deliver 3 specific pieces of information: the resident engagement strategy, your safety case report, and your mandatory occurrence report itself. And they will then review that as part of the building assessment process. And if they are happy with all 3 elements, they will issue a building assessment certificate. What we heard recently from the regulator is that something in the region of 90 to 95% of assessment certificates are not being issued. They are being refused because of a failure in some way, shape or form, generally relating to the safety case report and resident engagement strategy. So what are the key themes that are coming out of this process, and what are the expectations and requirements from the regulator themselves? Well, interestingly, the regulator has made it very, very clear in a number of seminars, one literally last week, where the regulator actually gave us a little bit of emerging themes or early learnings, as they like to call it, some of which related to resident engagement strategies. They stated very clearly that some resident engagement strategies are not specific to the building. There's a tendency for many people to go for the one-size-fits-all approach. You know, I've got a number of buildings. I'm going to therefore apply the same resident engagement strategy to every single building and therefore every single resident. And so what the regulator is extremely concerned about is that principal accountable persons are not taking into account the needs and preferences of the specific group of residents within each particular building. So that's the first key theme that the regulator has stated and is extremely concerned about. In addition, they've made it very clear that that one size fits all just does not work. High-rise residents are a diverse population, and it does come down to the tenure types, the nature of the residents themselves, and the location as well. So we therefore have to understand that just because I've got a single approach, that I can deal with it on that basis. And when I talk about specific to the buildings, I'm also talking about specific to the building even within an estate. You will have differences within estates, and the regulator again is expecting that even on an estate, they do not want to see a one size fits all approach. Each resident engagement strategy has to be aimed specifically at the building, specifically at the residents as well. Yes, you can take into account the available community, and the estate will be formed an essential part of that community, but it has to be on the building, and it has to be to those specific, that specific group of residents. And finally, they've made it very clear that there is a very clear, distinct difference in the law regarding the providing of information, which is a legal requirement under Section 89 of the Building Safety Act, and engagement and consultation, which is under Section 91, as we've discussed, which is obviously and very clearly a two-way process. So they were the emerging themes that came out of discussions with the regulator relating to building assessment certificate applications, and very specifically to resident engagement strategies. So the regulator themselves have actually produced some documentation. So we are very clearly no longer dealing with theory. What we have from the regulator is a very, very detailed document as to exactly what they will be reviewing when they actually review your building assessment certificate. And you will see that there is a single section on a resident engagement strategy, which is 3 pages of very clear, very detailed requirements and assessment criteria that they will be looking at when reviewing your resident engagement strategy. So what I want to do is just take you through very quickly what the resident engagement strategy, as far as the regulator is concerned, should include. And the RES numbers are direct references. So if you want to use this, you can therefore direct that straight back if you're able to get hold of a copy of the criteria document, which is available online. And you should be able to therefore understand that effectively you've got to include a description of the type of information that you will be providing, a description of the type of building safety decisions that you will be consulting on, and then it's got some evidence there allowing you to actually include certain exclusions, and how, and detailing how you will be consulting and acting upon urgent matters such as emergency requirements. It details very clearly how you intend to obtain the views of relevant persons within your specific building, and it must include evidence as to the range of methods for obtaining those views that you are adopting. It's got to describe how those views are actually considered and then fed into the decision-making process. And in addition, it's got to describe the methods of measurement of how effective the participation has actually been. So it's not just a case of, oh, I've undertaken a consultation. You've now got to start to measure this and measure it over a period of time so you can determine how effective your resident engagement is. Res 11 is a very detailed one, and it provides a lot of information. You've got to outline how, as a PAP, you're going to inform residents when works are undertaken. You've got to inform residents about nuisances and access issues caused by those works. You've got to be able to keep records and allow those records to be shared. And also, you've got to ensure that you are consulting with residents as well, and how you actually go about that particular process. And in addition, the assessment criteria is that your strategy has got to very clearly detail the date that you have undertaken the strategy and any future review dates, which must not exceed 2 years. So that's the basic criteria that are set out within the actual criteria document that I've shown earlier. But the regulator has also been very explicit. Again, in a recent webinar, the regulator made it very clear, the deputy regulator actually made it very clear that industry has to accept that the new building safety regime actually requires of all of us a new way of thinking, a new way of doing, a new way of acting, and a new culture. And it's that culture element that they are extremely concerned about. They're extremely concerned that many people are still doing the minimum, still gaming the system, still trying to thrive on a lack of clarity in legislation and guidance. So they are introducing guidance, they are introducing risk-based guidance, which has to be followed. But what was interesting was the parting shot from the regulator himself, which he basically said that what we used to do in the past will not be sufficient in the future. Things have to change. Now, we all know that the regulator is suffering some problems of its own at the moment, but that doesn't stop them from actually making sure that the law is actually applied as expected and that the guidance issued both by the regulators' bosses, which is the HSC, and the government are actually applied. So let's again just go through the regulator's expectations regarding certain elements. So in their guidance, they made it very clear that the resident engagement strategy has got to include information that will be provided to relevant persons about decisions relating to the management of the building. Their guidance makes it very clear that the strategy should include how the building's residents' needs and preferences have been considered when and how you provide information. And so therefore it's important, and this is the regulator saying this now, it's important to determine and understand those needs and preferences for each separate building or part thereof. If you are only responsible for half of the building, then you're responsible for ensuring that you understand the needs and preferences of residents within that. And basically they are saying and asking you a very simple question: how or do you know what the residents' needs and preferences are in each of your buildings? So again, the Building Safety Regulator in their guidance makes it very clear that the law requires that all aspects of the decisions that you make will be consulted upon, and that the arrangements for obtaining and taking into account the views of relevant persons are included within the resident engagement strategy. The guidance sitting behind that, it's risk-based guidance, therefore, if you follow it, you're deemed to satisfy the law. Basically says that the strategy should include how the different needs and preferences of the residents for which you are responsible for are taken into account. So again, the question is very simple. Do you know what the residents' needs and preferences are in each of your buildings? And then again, the regulator has made it very clear that under the law, the resident engagement strategy must show how the appropriateness of the methods for promoting participation will be measured and kept under review. And the guidance to that makes it very clear that the strategy must include, guess what? The different needs and preferences of the residents. So the same question has got to be asked. Do you know what the residents' needs and preferences are in each of your buildings? Each building or each part of the building. Not the whole estate, not your whole portfolio. It needs to be focused on each individual building. So just so you are aware of how the regulator is dealing with this, the building assessment certification process has effectively, as I said earlier, relies upon 3 elements being submitted to the regulator. And what the regulator has done has effectively set themselves up with 3 particular departments. The department for looking after resident engagement strategy is completely separate to the safety case report, and it's completely separate to the mandatory occurrence team. And so they will be looking at the resident engagement strategy in complete isolation to your safety case report. Now that separate department has, as I've said, has a very predetermined assessment criteria that is following. But again, guidance issued by the Building Safety Regulator makes it very clear that the demographics, the accessibility and considerations, and resident profiling, promotion of information and results, and determining the methods of engagement have to be specifically for a particular block and a particular cohort of residents. And they have made it very clear. Failure to have dealt with this in that particular method means that your building assessment certificate could be refused. Okay, so we've gone through what the background is. We know what the law requires. We know what the building regulators' expectations are. Let's have a quick look at what resident engagement actually is. So resident engagement is very clearly defined as the proactive efforts made to interact and involve residents in various aspects of building safety. It goes way beyond simply addressing repairs and maintenance requests. It encompasses building an inclusive living environment that ensures that residents feel safe and are comfortable in reporting issues, knowing that they will be listened to, knowing that they will also be able to trust that things will change. And it's that word trust that is really vital here. Trusting that they will be listened to, not ignored. Trusting that their views and opinions will be taken into account. Now, they may not be agreed with. You may not agree with the views of a resident, but that means, though, that you have got to engage with them to ensure that they understand why you are not going to do something. And we can't just be directing that information back at them. Engagement is a two-way process. So engagement and communication, therefore, are two different, very, very clearly different concepts. Communication is basically referring to the act of just sharing information, whereas engagement is about building relationships and fostering active participation. Communication is clearly necessary for successful engagement to occur, but it's not sufficient on its own. And that is the concern that the regulator has at the moment. Too many people are just communicating. They are not engaging. They're not delivering ongoing dialogue and feedback exchange between the two parties. That should always be highly encouraged. And effectively developing that two-way relationship with your residents is going to ensure that resident engagement not only is going to be successful, but it's also going to be accepted. So resident engagement is not a one-directional process. It's bi-directional. It means that you have to listen. You have to also communicate as well. Communicating is an essential part of engagement, but so is listening. And importantly, and so is doing. So actually acting is just as important as listening and communicating. So knowing who lives within your block is absolutely vital in actually understanding and developing successful resident engagement. Knowing who is there, understanding why residents live in and the way that they do is very, very important. Understanding your residents' demographics will actually help you also create bespoke strategies that are suitable for their wants and their needs. And I want to look at how we obtain that information later. And obviously, we've got to accept that actually demographics change. And in some buildings, they change regularly. So in the build to rent sector, resident demographics are likely to change far more frequently than they will be in other types of tenure. So what's important is how you adjust your engagement approach to your particular residents as well. So reviewing and updating and adjusting your resident engagement on differing frequencies may be required depending upon the building, depending upon the tenure. So what information then needs to be included within a resident engagement strategy for each building? Well, under both the legislation and the guidance issued by both the regulator and the government as well, your resident engagement strategy has got to include effectively 9 key areas. They include, firstly, details of your residents' preferences and needs, as well as the actual demographics as well. You need to be able to understand all of the details of the accountable persons within the building, not just the principal accountable person, but any other accountable person. And it's a good idea to include others as well, such as your responsible persons as well, although that is not a legal requirement. You need to actually ensure that you know how any accountable person is currently engaging with residents. For example, if you are the PAP and there are other accountable persons, there is a duty to cooperate and coordinate your activities here. And so therefore you need to understand how other accountable persons are actually engaging with residents and how they intend to tell residents about building safety work and who's going to be carrying out that work. In addition, you need the current and available safety information that you will be able to provide residents. Now, there's a legal requirement to provide certain types of information, but there's also a legal opportunity for residents to request additional information. And basically, effectively, if you think of it this way, anything that's part of a building safety case, any part of your safety case as well, any elements surrounding your safety case report, a fire strategy, your resident engagement strategy, your fire risk assessment, your structural risk assessment, all of those can be requested by a resident or a relevant person. You've also got to include details of your complaints system that will be used for relevant building safety complaints. So that's a complaint relating to fire and structural safety issues. And also a system in place where and how residents can submit relevant building safety concerns, otherwise known as a mandatory occurrence or a safety occurrence as well. And then finally, the 3 other elements you've got to include is details of actually the Building Safety Regulator and how a resident can contact the Building Safety Regulator directly, and also how residents will be informed about their own responsibilities and how those responsibilities will be managed. Responsibilities such as not allowing them to manipulate, engage with essential fire safety or structural safety equipment. And the last part of the resident engagement, it needs to include records of any relevant consultations carried out to date. In addition to those particular areas, it needs to be evidenced and demonstrated that all of those aspects that are being met. That's what the regulator is expecting within your strategy, that over a time you are meeting all of those 9 key requirements. Okay, so how do we understand residents' demographics, needs, and preferences? Well, in order to provide a reasonable and proportional approach to the legislation, successful engagement must be bespoke to both the people who live within your building, each individual building, the building itself, and in many ways to the wider community. And when we talk about wider community, we're talking about visitors, staff especially, and contractors. So the strategy has got to be built upon the needs and the requirements of residents. And so that requires their active input. You've got to give them the opportunity in order to engage. It's not just a case of you engaging with them. That's just communication. You need to have active input from residents, and that will determine how your engagement strategy and what your engagement strategy will actually look like. So there are 6 pieces of information that we would recommend that you need to capture as part of those demographic needs and preferences. Firstly, age. You know that you're duty bound to consult with and provide information to all residents over 16 years old. So you need to know if you've got anybody who is 16 years old. It's also a good idea to actually find out other age groups as well, because that will actually help you understand the use of technology. And also, if you've got, for example, people who are coming up close to the age of 16, then you know how you are going to be able to deal with them. You've got to understand and therefore ask what's their preferred language for communication. That'll actually help you deliver information in the right way and consult in the right way as well, and actually determine if you need to use any translation services. You need to actually ask them very, very clearly what's their preferred method of communication and how they want to receive information. It may be that they are looking for emails or a WhatsApp group. That may be their preference. It may be that they want to have face-to-face meetings. You've got to determine the preferred method for communication and the preferred method for consultation as well. You also need as well to understand if there is anybody within the household that needs additional support to evacuate from the building. Now, whilst it isn't a specific requirement in this piece of legislation, there is other pieces of legislation that are coming up in respect of this, and so you are duty bound to make reasonable efforts to support those who have particular needs, or at least to offer support. And then finally, you need to be asking the question, does anybody else need support in understanding the instructions, i.e. what to do in an emergency? You are again duty bound to consider that and update and publish information to residents. So those needs and preferences are key. So how can you get hold of that? Well, you need to gather information by many different ways. The ways that we have been found to be most successful is to survey your residents. You can actually include that straight away within welcome packs or resident information packs, as well as, if you have got them, resident apps, and ask for information. So the questions you ask in respect of any resident engagement demographic survey is actually going to be of great assistance here. It's going to evidence to the regulator that you are using residents' preferred methods of engagement. So that's going to be one tick in that very, very big box. It's going to actually also form a baseline for which you're able to measure how successful your engagement is. If you have a very low level of engagement at the start and 2 years later it's doubled, well, then you're able to prove that your engagement has been successful. It allows you to overcome barriers to any engagement and ensure as well that the information that you are getting and the engagement that you are planning is actually accessible. And in addition to that, it ensures that you understand exactly what safety information needs to be promoted. Now, we talked about earlier about reasonable and proportionate, and I just very, very quickly want to talk about that. There is very much a great deal of confusion and understandable concern in the industry that there is a need for a complete overhaul of the services and information that you provide residents. For some, that may be the case, but for many, you are already communicating and engaging. And so, again, if you're not engaging, now is the time to stop communicating and engage. So during webinars and in-person conferences, the regulator has been often questioned to understand why and what they need to do. And they often get a very ambiguous, it's got to be reasonable and proportionate answer from the actual regulator. So the regulator then actually produced some relatively interesting questions and potential answers to these. So issues such as, is it reasonable and proportionate that you provide information in a multitude of languages at great cost? Well, they turned around and said, not necessarily. You need to be able to provide information to the majority. So if the majority will require it in English, great. If there is a reasonable number of people who require it in a second language, then you may want to consider that. But actually, why not stop? Why not think, oh, hold on a moment, can we provide safety information in a different way, in a more visually informative format? So emergency procedures, for example, do they always have to be solely written? Can we not include pictograms or signpost residents to certain key areas? But is it proportional as well to have a high response rate to any surveys, questionnaires, or consultations that you undertake? Again, no. The regulator themselves has suggested that if someone's getting a response rate of 10%, 10 to 15%, then actually, do you know what? That's not too bad. If someone's getting something up near 30%, then actually they're doing extremely well. So just make sure that the information and the questionnaires and approach is as accessible as possible. Make engagement available. Is it reasonable and proportionate to know who is occupying short-term properties, sublet properties, Airbnbs, for example, within your block at any one time? Again, no, according to the regulator, but you should at least make efforts. And it's that when you should start holding others to account. So if we've got people who are subletting, you've got to make sure that they understand that they've got to be able to provide information and allow them to consult with you and engage with you. And is it reasonable and proportionate that you provide safety information in a large number of formats? No. Again, you need to determine the preferred methods of engagement and communication from the majority. So reasonable and proportionate is a really important part. But a common question that we get asked is how can we demonstrate that we are engaging with residents when the majority of them just don't want to be involved? Well, engagement has got to be undertaken. So give people an opportunity. You will have to try and engage the disengaged. You need to be able to accept that some residents will not want to be engaged with. They will stay at a level that they are comfortable with. And also you need to ensure that your engagement allows for that. It allows for people who want to be involved, and that people who don't want to be, well, you still try and engage with them, but at least you're providing them with the right information. And it's been suggested that effectively we've got 5 levels of engagement. You've got the likes of people who just want to be made aware, the tenants and residents who actually are given an opportunity to engage, but you know, they're not going to. You're going to have to accept that some people are going to stay within that level. You're going to have others who will opt in. You're going to have residents who are going to respond to surveys. They are going to respond to contact. You're then going to get, though, others who will want to actively participate. They will attend resident meetings. They will get involved with online discussions. But you're also going to have another group or 2 more groups of people who will want to have a greater degree of engagement. You're going to have others who want to co-create. They will want to consult with you. They will want to help you create your processes and procedures that actually directly affect them. Now, you are going to have people who are going to go through all layers of these. You're going to have people who are going to get stuck at a particular layer. But that isn't a problem. It's recognizing that you have to deal with them in a different way, because you are also going to have people who are going to lead the way. You're going to have residents who want to sit on scrutiny panels. They want to sit on boards. They want to sit on improvement groups. They want to be heavily involved. It's really important that you recognize that every different person, every different resident, even within different households, are going to have different levels of engagement. You have to accept that. You have to try and promote that engagement. But at the end of the day, if people only want to be made aware, and that's all you've been able to do, then that's what you've got to work with. So I just really want to end now with a very, very quick case study. We've been producing resident engagement strategies for 3 or 4 years now. And I just want to basically take you through one for one particular building for one particular client. This is an 8-story building. It's only got 33 units. It's got a number of leaseholders and some shared owners as well. And some of the flats, although it's now reduced significantly, were actually on short-term lets as well. At the time that the managing agent took over this particular building from another managing agent, there had been a complete breakdown in trust. There was zero trust, basically because of historic poor service delivery, poor performance from the regulator, and effectively there was absolutely zero engagement with the residents, the owners, and the managing agent. Nobody wanted to talk to each other, and if they did, it was at a heightened degree of anger. So the client decided initially to actually survey the residents. They decided to ask them how successful they were being. And they got a score of 2 out of 10. And they got actually, I thought, a reasonable response rate of around about 51%. If you were to go to the regulator now, they turn around and say that's done really well. But they also looked at other elements as well, and they were trying to get into apartments, and they were only getting a 15% access rate in respect of that. Now, all of these are actually very helpful because they set a baseline for that particular client on how they could improve this whole process. They identified when they actually went through the surveys that there were issues, and then they built a resident engagement strategy and, importantly, an implementation plan that actually had direct input from a small number of residents. They carried out a very, very interesting education program, not just in respect of the residents by telling them what the new regime was all about, their responsibilities, and the responsibilities in law for the managing agent and the accountable person. But they also did that as well for staff and residents, basically to give staff the confidence in their roles and to actually build confidence that they knew who the staff were, they knew that those staff were competent to do their role. So after 12 months, the client decided to again speak to their residents, to consult with their residents. They weren't going to wait for 2 years. This was just at a time when the regulations actually came into force. And so they again did a demographic survey and a needs and preferences survey, and they had a much higher level. 82% of tenants actually responded in this position. They also had a much higher degree of tenant satisfaction. It had risen to 8 out of 10. And they were also getting a higher degree of inspection access at over 54%. So in addition to that, staff reported being more confident in dealing with issues, dealing with sometimes adverse problems, and they were actually much happier at work. So they were able to actually prove straight away that successful engagement had started at an early stage. And then when they were having to go through some block remedial works to the external facade, it was only a small amount of work, but it was going to be quite a lengthy process. That process went extremely well. People understood it, and they actually had zero numbers of complaints about that program and about that project as they went through it. It helped with the project actually going through on time, which is exceedingly helpful. So just really want to bring this to a conclusion and just give you some takeaways. Resident engagement really needs to be specific to each building, to each particular building, to the residents and to the local community. The Building Safety Regulator has made it very clear. One size does not fit all. I think it's important that we need to be proportional and we need to be practical where we can. So don't expect that everyone will or will want to be involved. You're not going to get 100%. But if you do, that's a great news story. I think it's really important that decision making, when we talk about that, is all about building safety decisions. So not every decision of the block has to be considered, but hey, why not anyway? Certainly our clients who see it that way are actually seeing improvements in relation to engagement and customer satisfaction. And please don't forget staff. Engagement is a two-way process. Staff need to know about the fact that and feel confident and comfortable in their role when they engage with people. We recognize that it's challenging to know who lives in the building, but you've got to try. So you can't just turn around and say, well, we're not going to bother to survey them. Survey your staff, because it's really important. It's a great way of actually proving to the regulator what you've got to work with. And finally, not finally, sorry, it's really important that you review your strategy every 2 years, but very importantly, act in accordance with the strategy. I've gone a little bit longer than I was hoping to do, Tara, but do we have any questions?
Thank you, David. Yes, we have had a significant volume of questions come through, which is great to see. Majority of questions, David, at the moment are in regards consultation. So in essence, the main queries we're getting is in regards, yes, the 3-week consultation period. Is the expectation that this is only done prior to submitting your strategy, or after the strategy has been submitted to the regulator? Do you still need to complete consultation processes with your demographic residents?
You've got to complete consultation processes over a period of time. If you are making changes to the building, you have to consult. If you are making or have reported a mandatory occurrence, you have a legal duty to consult. So it isn't just a case of, oh, I've written my strategy, I've done my consultation, well, I can forget about that going forward. Consultation is an ongoing, living, breathing process. You can't just do it once. So once you've finished your resident engagement strategy, consult. Next time you decide to review your strategy, take that consultation information into account, but you may have to consult at other stages as well, as I mentioned.
Right. Okay. And another query in regards consultation is, what if it's objected? The residents do not agree with it, they refuse to agree to it, and they cannot move forward. Is this something you've seen in your experience, or what would the expectation here in regards submitting your resident engagement strategy where your residents do not agree and are objecting to the contents?
You have to submit your resident engagement strategy to the regulator, but that's not the key element here. The key element here is actually ensuring that you get successful engagement. And it's the actual resident engagement strategy has got to be provided to the residents themselves. If the residents are not going to agree, you've got to consider what degree and level of unhappiness that you actually have. It may be a couple of people who are not happy. But if you've got a substantial number of people, then I think the regulator is going to expect you to develop a plan as to how you are going to consult on a greater level, how you are going to take their views into account. And ultimately, the regulator themselves can actually force you to go through that process. So it's an extremely difficult situation to work with. Have we had that? Not that I'm aware of.
Yes.
I think the way to go through this is to actually start very, very early, engage very, very early. And the first thing you need to do is to ask questions of the tenants themselves, the residents themselves. Ask those the 6 key questions: age, etc., etc. What's their preferred methodologies for communicating? What's their preferred methodologies for consulting? And if they turn around and tell you that it's a face-to-face meeting, then run face-to-face meetings.
Right.
And that's how we would go through it.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, David. We've had a couple of questions come through as well in regards AWOB's law. Do we know at this stage, has there been any further dialogue or information provided by the BSR in regards of how this is expected to affect the private sector?
Okay, the BSR will not be the enforcing agency for AWAB's law as it stands at the moment. I don't think it will ever come through to the Building Safety Regulator in its current state and current position. AWAB's law, according to the government, the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, she made it very clear in a statement to the House about a month and a half, 2 months ago, that they are pushing ahead with AWAB's law, especially for social housing providers, but that they were intending, and again, they were intending to extend that out into certain elements of the private rented sector. Unfortunately, we've got no more further detail yet, but we need to be constantly monitoring that, because we still don't know the mechanisms that sit behind AWAB's law.
Great. Okay, thank you, David. Just conscious of time, and I know there's a high volume of questions that have come through. So in essence, if you could please continue to contact Ark Workplace Risk, we will endeavour to respond to the questions that you have raised, and we will be putting out an output of the presentation as well. So thank you for your time, and thank you, David, and we can conclude today's session.
Thank you.